and welcome. My name is Kate Walsh, as it turns out. Some of you may recognize me from shows like Grey's Anatomy or Private Practice, Umbrella Academy. I'm not going to list my whole resume, but I am excited to join you today in a new series, The Green Room, a series of climate conversations. So today I'm super excited to be joined by WWF's, whenever I say WWF, I think of the World Wrestling Federation, but this is the World Wildlife Fund. So just let's be really clear about that. Although, Marlene, I'm sure you could probably do some damage in the ring. But I am joined by WWF Senior Vice President of Climate Change, Marcene Mitchell. This week, even more WWF experts will be featured to talk about the climate crisis, the work that's being done to adapt to the impacts that we were already seeing, prevent further impacts of a warming world, reduce warming, and more. So Marcene, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, I'd love to. So I'm Marcene Mitchell, and as you mentioned, I'm the Senior Vice President of Climate Change at WWF, where we recognize that the climate crisis is here today and that it affects every person, every animal, every ecosystem, and every community that we care about. And as a global organization, we feel like WWF has a strong record and that we're uniquely positioned to tackle this crisis. And I'm sure we're going to talk more about this, but I just want to start first and say, Kate, thank you so much for sharing your time and your voice to support this further important work.
I'm so happy to be here. It's the least that I could do. I think we're all critically and urgently aware of what's going on with our climate. And I don't think there's a day that goes by where I'm not watching the news saying, okay, what's Congress doing? What is the world doing now? What's the next step? So to that end, why, in your humble opinion, or very well researched and qualified opinion, why is now the time to have these important conversations?
Right. Well, as you know, I mean, this is not a new conversation, but it's growing more and more urgent, right? The climate crisis has been a looming threat for years, but we're seeing these impacts that are intensifying. I mean, this summer in the US, we've seen severe drought conditions that have plagued much of the West, leading to water shortages, crop failures, and those dramatic wildfires. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has announced that June was the hottest on record in the US, as heat waves rolled across the country, and the average temperature was up by 4.2 degrees, hotter than it usually is. So all this serves to highlight and provide context to the recent UN report that showed in detail how we are irreversibly altered the planet. And that doesn't mean that we should throw in the towel. There is definitely hope. Our decisions in the weeks to months to come will have a profound impact on our environment for generations, for your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So moments like the COP26 climate conference, which is happening now in Glasgow, represents huge, important opportunities for the governments to raise their climate ambitions and increase the actions necessary to limit the vulnerability of our current and future generations to climate change. So what we're seeing is global warming coming to the forefront of the lives of people around the world. And we must have these conversations now before the planet is further altered and the impacts cannot be reversed.
Right. So you mentioned that happening right now is a conference called the COP26, where countries are meeting to discuss climate action. What are these types of meetings? Why are they important to the climate crisis and everyday people? Like, why? Because I think a lot of people get overwhelmed. They're like, what? Where do I start? It seems overwhelming. So why right now is it critical?
Right. So it's funny, for years, we kind of felt, particularly here in the US, that climate was something that was happening, years in the future, that it was something that wasn't really happening to us. But there's been a recent study by Yale University that showed that more than half of Americans now believe that climate change is impacting their lives right now, today. And that's really, really different. The scientists are telling us that we need to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius in order to be in the safe zone. And that to do that, we have to decrease our emissions of the GHGs by half over the next 9 years and to zero, absolutely no emissions in the next 30 years. So when we look at what are the governments doing to keep us safe, what are they doing to reduce these emissions? Well, right now, all the governments in the world coming together, they have made pledges to keep us on a path of 2.7 degrees warming versus what we need to be safe is 1.5 degrees. So there's a huge gap between where we're at and where we need to go. And this level of warming at 2.7 degrees, I mean, this is going to be a major threat to mankind. I mean, we're talking to our coastal cities, to the working of our economy, to the ability of people to live in significant areas around the globe. So the meeting at COP is an opportunity for us to try to advance the climate conversation and to build momentum with these governments around meaningful climate action. So 6 years ago, in 2015, we had the COP21 in Paris, where 197 nations, that's almost every nation in the world, came together and they pledged to reduce the emissions to this safe level. But we have not done that yet, right? And so our hope is that we need to keep up the pressure. In this COP, we need to push our governments to increase their ambitions, to increase their commitments, to make sure that the emissions are reduced and we stay safe. When governments raise their climate ambitions, these kind of results can be obtained. And so governments, businesses, they're both powerful and essential actors who can take on this climate crisis. And so as individuals, we also have power, right? We have the power as voters, we have the power as consumers, and we need to make our voice heard. We need to speak up, not only for ourselves, but also to protect the vulnerable, both in this country and abroad, because those are the people who get hurt the first.
Right. Wow. Okay. You spoke about why these are important on an international level, but what about here in the U.S.? How is that relevant to Americans across the country? I mean, obviously, there's the coastal cities. But I think that it's shocking to me to hear that there was a meeting 5 years ago and nothing really the needle hasn't been moved forward. And yet, obviously, we've had a global pandemic. We've had all these things that are very interconnected with climate. So why, I'll stop about how shocked I am that really, and also I just want to digress for a second and say, this doesn't seem, and maybe this is more to the point of why it affects Americans, but it doesn't seem like there's a real compromise here. We're asking for X, but we'll give you Y, or 2.7. Why isn't there a room for compromise, right? Because there's a lot of people that think, oh, well, if we get to 2.7, that's better than nothing. But tell me why it's critical now and for Americans.
Yeah, so for Americans is important. As I said, more Americans are now actually feeling that climate is impacting their lives. Like we're seeing it in our world, right? We're seeing the storms, we're seeing the damage, we're seeing the wildfires. And it's starting to really worry us. And we want our politicians and our businesses to make a difference. I mean, the US has the second highest carbon footprint of any nation. China is the only one who's higher than us. And so if we're going to address this climate crisis, we have to do our part. The last administration stepped away from the Paris Agreement. But fortunately, President Biden has rejoined the agreement this year and has stepped up our ambition, has agreed to commit to reducing US carbon emissions by 50 to 52% in the next 9 years, which is a great step forward. And so the question is, how do we actually get this done, though? It's nice to have commitments, it's nice to make pledges, but how do we get this done? Because remember, we're following the science. And you asked about 2.7, but 1.5, can't we compromise? It's not linear. These steps up make a huge, huge difference. And if we don't follow the science, we don't know what can happen. So it's going to take all of us, not just the federal government. It's going to take states and cities and businesses and civil institutions, our churches, our schools. Everybody needs to work together to meet this moment, and we can do this. WWF has sponsored an organization called America is All In, and it's a coalition of all these partners, of the states, of the cities, of the universities, of our churches, of individuals working together to really scale climate action. And in fact, this work that we've done here in the US has inspired other coalitions to form around the world. And it's called the Alliances for Climate Action. And we now see coalitions happening in Argentina and Australia and Brazil and Japan and Mexico, South Africa, Vietnam. All these different countries are being inspired by what we're doing here in the US, and knowing that we all need to get together to raise our voices to really make some movement on this now.
Great. That's great. So there's so much happening in the climate space, it sounds like, which is great. And I think that coming together is critical. And I think of voting, I think of how consumers spend their money and the choices that we all have to make and how we can contribute in that way. But there is so much happening in the climate space. So while countries, states, cities, and other institutions are acting, individuals are raising awareness about the climate crisis as well. What are you seeing people do to educate others and advocate against global warming, and why is this so important and critical?
Yeah, well, I talked about how people are now feeling like it's impacting them. It's not something that's just about melting
This
ice caps.
nebulous.
Yeah, bleaching coral reefs or some species that are being extinct, but it's happening here and it's happening to us and it's happening for our children. I mean, I think that's a big piece that people want. And then I also feel like with all the things that we've had recently in this country with Black Lives Matter and our awakening in terms of inequalities in this country and inequalities abroad, we're realizing that the vulnerable populations, particularly lower income communities of color, are going to disproportionately feel the effects of climate change. And we saw that with the pandemic. We saw how these communities, were vulnerable to this, right? That the pandemic should have been an equal, organizer to infect people, but because people were living in situations where their health was poor, they were living in more vulnerable situations, that they were infected more. And the same things with climate change. So we have to understand that, and we have to be fighting not only for ourselves and for our children, but for all the people that are going to be have an impact. And so we may ask ourselves, like, what can I do? People feel like this is such an overwhelming problem. It's a global problem, and what can I do as a single person? And we know that we can do certain things in our lives. We can drive less, or we can drive electric cars, or we can turn off our lights and be more efficient. We can avoid wasting food, things like that. And these are important. These are really important things too. But mostly important, and I come back to it time and time again, the most important thing is our voice. And we are really lucky to live in a democracy where we can impact our government and our policymakers. And we also live in a society where we are big consumers, and we can impact the businesses in terms of letting them know that it matters to us how they act and their impact on the climate. And then finally, we're employees as well, right? And someone said to me, we need a Greta Thunberg in every company. And so, whether we're, working in an actors guild on the set, or whether we're working in Microsoft, or whether we're working in an NGO, each of us can also be kind of activists within our own world and letting our voices speak.
It's great. I mean, vote, vote, vote. And I think for me, I just think that's the easiest way to have your voice heard is vote on everything. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about the last several years in America anyway, and the world arguably, but is a raising of consciousness. And, I mean, geez, when I grew up, it was like, oh, one day I'll be able to vote for the president. And I think there's a lot more consciousness around voting for down the ticket or starting in local, very local, with city council, with board members, with representatives, with, you know, voting in every election that you can. That is a huge gift, and it's often just, I feel, squandered, but it's getting better in America. And also, I think you really made a great point, Marcene, about that we don't. I think a lot of times economically, people also think, oh, that's not my sector. That's for people that are investors or in big businesses. But we do have a lot of power economically to move the needle. We as consumers decide what we're going to buy and what we're not going to buy, and particularly women. So that's just a really exciting thing, I think, in terms of people who feel like overwhelmed by climate. What can I possibly do? I'm recycling, I'm doing this, or I'm turning off my, but I mean, I think how you spend your money, and every little bit counts. Even, you know, when I was in my apartment around the corner in New York City, they're starting to compost. You know, there's a composting center. So there's little baby steps that everybody can make. And honestly, how people spend their money is a critical one. So with all these things in mind, Marcene, can you tell us a little bit about how WWF looks at the climate crisis and the work that you, I mean, specifically are going to do, or that you're doing right now?
Right. So
not you
in addition,
personally, but
I
WWF.
started WWF. And so in addition
Feel
to
free
the
to edit. Feel free to edit. Feel free to edit.
So in addition to the things we talked about in terms of influencing governments and businesses, I mean, they do listen to us. They're paying attention to how we're spending our money. But one of the cool things about working at WWF, which is a conservation organization, is understanding the incredible power of nature, which itself is a solution to the climate crisis, right? Through smart nature-based climate solutions, we can remove carbon from the atmosphere. So when you think about, you know, well, how do we bring some of this carbon down? You know, one of the ways is through our forests and through our agriculture lands and our grasses and our wetlands. These are all ways that can reduce emissions of GHGs. In fact, there's a study that says up to 30% of the emissions that we need to reduce can be reduced through these, you know, investment in nature. And that's wonderful. And at the same time, we can help communities and wildlife adapt to the changes in climate. We can foster biodiversity for our planet. So it's a win-win-win. By investing in nature, we help the climate, we help our biodiversity, we help our water systems, and we help our planet. So it's very exciting. One of the examples is that we've been working with the Red Cross to help people after a hurricane or a disaster. How do we rebuild in a way that's environmentally responsible? How do we use natural systems like mangroves or like wetlands to, you know, reduce the impact of storms? And there are just so many cool things that we can do with nature to help us. Instead of fighting nature, we can use nature to help us. And so WWF has been at the forefront of helping raise these issues, helping raise corporate ambition around this issue and defining climate leadership. We work with companies as well, helping them get science-based targets to reducing their emissions, and we work with governments to you know, work with the communities to help protect particularly vulnerable people. So there's so much climate work that we do. It's impossible to do it all justice in the short time we have together. It's a huge challenge, but it's one that we can meet. This is something that we can solve. So I always want to give people feel overwhelmed by it, but I want to give people hope. I want to get people knowing that there's so much innovation that we can do. There's so much that we can do. We can defeat this. We can beat this, for sure.
Oh, Marcene, thank you so much. I think that that's a great point, is that, again, because I go back to when I think about friends or people that I know in my communities of people feeling overwhelmed, but that never underestimate. It's not just hope, like, yay, a song and a prayer, that it's actually the human innovation, our ability to adapt, our ability to be creative, to find solutions is never ending. And things are going to keep evolving and changing, and we're going to keep having to come up with new solutions. And that's the exciting part.
Good at it.
Anyway, I wanted to thank you, Marcene, so much. Yeah, we're good at it. I loved hearing also what you had to say about working in concert with nature and listening to that and how we can and move with nature to solve this problem as well. Thank you very much. I wanted to, can you just tell our audience what they can expect to learn in the Green Room series this week?
I will. So, but first, I do want to thank you as well. Thanks for taking your time. Thanks for being, passionate about this and, joining us on this important stage and getting people this information. So we're really grateful to you, Kate, for all that. In the coming days, a variety of WWF experts and influential individuals will be talking about the environment and disaster management, protecting wildlife in a warming world, the way food impacts the planet, and nature-based solutions to the climate crisis.
Cool. That sounds great. So exciting. So thrilled to talk to you. I really appreciate your time. And that's a wrap on the first episode of The Green Room. Thank you, everyone, for watching, and stay tuned for more information about the climate crisis.
Thank you. Bye.